Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Cyberpunk Cinema, an online panel presented by the inaugural Sydney Science Fiction Film Festival. I am your host, Travis Johnson, film critic extraordinaire, and I have been joined by an incredible roster of genre creatives who are good enough to sacrifice their time on a beautiful Saturday afternoon to come and talk the dark future with me. So, with no further ado, we have Grant Sputore, the director of I Am Mother. Say hello, Grant.
Hey, everybody.
We have Ben Young, the director of Extinction.
Hello.
We have Ben Lucas, the director of OtherLife.
Hello.
And we're all from Perth, which is a bit weird. We have Sara Joyce, the creator of Machete Girl.
Hello.
And we have acclaimed novelist Traci Harding of the Ancient Futures trilogy.
That's right. I didn't make the film 2067, but I hope to have made a few by 2067. So we've got that in common.
Fantastic. Unfortunately, Seth Larney, the director of 2067, could not join us because he's in pre-production for something new, which is, you know, that's where the priority lies, right? So Traci was good enough to jump in at the last minute to sort of round out the panel and make us a little more diverse because we're really, like, most of us are just white guys. So this is cool. So we're here to talk about cyberpunk cinema. Now, cyberpunk is, of course, a genre. It's a literary and cinematic genre. Had its inception in the early 80s with the 1-2 punch of Blade Runner and Tron in 1982, which very much informed literary works such as William Gibson's Neuromancer. We also got Escape from New York in 1981, which is kind of my ground zero. But I want to go around the panel and just go, what was your introduction to cyberpunk as a concept, as an aesthetic, as a genre, and what do you dig about it? So I'll start with Ben Lucas, who I know is a big fan.
I stepped backwards into the cinematic side of things. I started with role-playing games. And in fact, in my early 20s, I worked on a few. I worked on a game called Rifts, which was like a greatest hits of every science fiction element you could think of thrown into one setting.
Yeah, Palladium Games, right?
That's right. Yeah, Palladium. I did a little bit of, I think, probably unpublished work for Artel Saurian and Mike Pondsmith, who did Cyberpunk 2020. And what that gave me is a list of films that I'd already seen, but I hadn't really identified as belonging to one particular genre. And that's what I mean by step backwards into it, because then I kind of got to rewatch them with fresh eyes.
Okay. Mr. Young, what are your feelings about this whole cyberpunk?
Well, I mean, it's sort of arguable, like it's a very broad genre, and there's a lot of movies that many would call cyberpunk and many wouldn't. And, you know, maybe it's controversial, but I think Terminator is cyberpunk, and that's sort of my favorite.
Of course it is, yeah.
Traci, how about you?
Oh, when I started writing fantasy, I didn't know I was writing fantasy. So I don't usually box things, but when you sort of say cyberpunk, I kind of think of like Fifth Element, like that kind of period for me. Like I loved all those kind of movies where there was a lot of machine. It wasn't necessarily your standard cyberpunk, but I liked a lot of the kind of weirder ones, you know, like say Cloud Atlas or something like that. That was a bit out there. And I mean, it definitely had elements of cyberpunk in it, but it wasn't technically all cyberpunk. And I like the way we smash genres together, actually.
Me too. Sara, I know you're a massive fan of the genre. Why don't you give us some of your sort of history with this weird dark future space we're discussing?
Well, I was actually taken into the cinema in '77 as a child to watch Star Wars. So I came from the sci-fi side of the genre and started reading a lot of novels from Harry Harrison. But it wasn't really until 1999 where I was in I'd already sort of gotten into the genre, but where I'd actually finally read Neuromancer and the Sprawl trilogy, and I just absolutely fell in love with it and realized that my life basically reflected Case's life at the time. So I was I was selling my wares and hacking and coding and doing all that kind of stuff, and and pretending that my Palm Pilot was a modern iPhone where I could communicate with people, that sort of thing. But I sort of led into it from films like Strange Days and and you know, the Matrix sort of was reflecting what I was going through at the time. So I was just like, oh wow, this is my story. And but yeah, definitely influenced by Blade Runner and Tron as a kid, watching it in the cinema, and a lot of other sci-fi which came up. So I think that you guys just touched on briefly there the differences between cyberpunk as a genre and having cyberpunk elements, which I think is very important to sort of determine, because films with cyberpunk elements definitely have a broader scope and range than sort of the specific cyberpunk ideology, which I think we'll get into at some point. But that's where I'm coming from.
Absolutely. And Grant, what have you got for us?
Yeah, I think I need that lesson on the hard definition of cyberpunk, because you know it is something that you do stumble your way into, like as you're falling in love with cinema and exploring the dark corners of the video store, as I was growing up. Like hearing Ben flag Terminator as cyberpunk isn't something that I'd ever sort of thought about, but then, you know, when he says it, immediately it kind of makes sense, right? Like that down and dirty, middle of the night, real world tech nightmare. You know, literally chrome machines coming out of fire sounds pretty cyberpunk to me, but you know, I hadn't considered it that way before. I think the first film that I found myself watching and realized, oh, this is another world, this is something really different, and the first film that kind of gave me pause to recognize that this was its own space was definitely Blade Runner. Like that was the one where I think I really did actually go, oh, hang on a minute now. Like, what's this about? What's inspired this? Like, you know, who are the artists that conceived this world, and what was this inspired by? So yeah, Blade Runner was a big one for me.
Speaking of James Cameron and Terminator, he actually called his genre tech noir, which kind of is similar to cyberpunk or cyberpunk adjacent. And that's why the nightclub in the first Terminator was called the tech noir, because that was his term for the sort of science fiction that he was trying to create in the early 80s.
Well, if there's one thing we've learned, it's to not question Cameron. If he says so, sure. Yes, tech noir.
He is my favorite oceanographer and occasional filmmaker. Okay, so like cyberpunk is sort of a very nebulous term, and you know, you can differentiate cyberpunk from, say, more general dystopian cinema, and of course Cameron's got his little kind of tech noir kind of, you know, house label. What do you think are the defining characteristics of a cyberpunk movie? Like, anyone jump in, hit me with some stuff.
I'll offer something. For me, cyberpunk is defined by the points in the future at which technology surpasses humanity. That seems to be the crossover. And that's why, you know, it can kind of touch in things like body horror. It can touch on social and corporate elements or economic elements as well, like any point that decisions that shape the world or the basically trample over people in order to get there. That to me feels like the edge of where cyberpunk drama exists, and I think you can see
where sort of Metropolis started, wasn't it? Like Metropolis gave us that ideology of the machine over man kind of idea.
Totally, and you know, in some ways you could say that cyberpunk cinematically is an extension of noir. But I honestly think that's just that's less about the genre and just more about the mood, because anytime your own humanity is eroded, invariably that feels dark, and so it lends itself to that aesthetic. Because I've heard people say that, oh, Casablanca could be a cyberpunk film, and you know, I get the point. I can sort of roll with that to a certain extent, but for me, it's specifically about the relationship between some piece of speculative technology and us.
Well, sadly, the cyberpunk version of Casablanca is the Pamela Anderson stinker Barbed Wire, which uses the plot from Casablanca in a dystopian future sort of action movie idiom. So maybe that didn't translate well as we wanted it to. But cyberpunk, I think, is also an aesthetic, because you say it's when technology starts to outstrip humanity. Well, 2001: A Space Odyssey deals with those themes, and I wouldn't call that cyberpunk. So is it the combination of the themes and a certain mood, a certain tone, a certain visual style? Like, how are we feeling about that?
There's a rebel element, isn't there? There has to be that rebel element that's kind of running through. Like, it's kind of Rage Against the Machine for me, I think. And I mean, a lot of films do that you necessarily wouldn't consider to be cyberpunk, but with the being able to explore the themes too with humanity, you kind of having that machine to offset that, because we find sometimes the machines turn out to be more human or more humane than humanity. And actually, just watching Extinction the other night, I found that it was really interesting. As soon as I found out, cybernetic, you kind of lost a bit of that sympathy for the character. It was really like you weren't as pained with what they were going through, because you knew that, I don't know, I lost that kind of, I mean, I regained it again during the film, but it was just interesting to see how I reacted to that kind of outcome. So it kind of challenges you as a human being too, like watching how machines react to us and how we react to them. And in something I'm writing, I was exploring the difference between AI and something that's transhuman. And actually the AI was kind of programmed not to harm us, but the transhuman still had those human qualities that could turn around and do that. So I thought that was interesting too. And that's all part of cyberpunk.
Somebody from the chat just mentioned it's a vibe, and that it's the punk elements which really define cyberpunk. And I have to agree with that as the core of the definition. I mean, a lot of people that join my magazine are sort of, they say they qualify cyberpunk as high tech, low life, but it really is this soul kind of punk element that I think separates it from things like 2001, whether it be far off in the future or in the near future. So it's that, like you were saying, it was a rebellious kind of side of the, I guess, of the punk movement that was adopted into things like Neuromancer and many other forms of cyberpunk, separating it from the wider dystopian films.
Okay, Ben Young,
like steampunk, for example.
Yeah, well, you can add punk to the end of any bloody sentence. There's wind punk now. There's all sorts of crazy versions. I mean, steampunk came along to explain, the sort of steam genre and all that kind of stuff with a bit of a aesthetic connected to the goth culture. So I don't see it necessarily as a punk-esque culture, whereas cyberpunk is more about that kind of rebellious attitude which you mentioned.
Yeah, I guess they've just got the techie thing that kind of connect them.
Yeah.
But now we're seeing like cyberpunk cinema being made by massive corporations, like anyone who can foot a $200 million movie is by definition a massive successful corporation. And but there's still stories about rebelling against corporations. Is rebellion kind of being commodified at that end of the budgetary scale? It's kind of, and Star Wars does the same thing. When Disney's telling you to rise up against the evil empire, that strikes me as a bit disingenuous. So like, how does that factor into your appreciation of the genre?
Yeah, it's tricky at this point, right? Like when I was discovering these cyberpunk films on VHS or whatever, like it did feel like an act of rebellion against the mainstream, that Blade Runner was so the anti-Star Wars, and even Terminator, if we're going to slip that into the genre against James Cameron's will, right? It's like there's something about it that's down and dirty and grungy and against the orders of the highest ups, and we're just going to make it work and make it happen and shine a light into the dark corners of sci-fi worlds that you otherwise might gloss over, right? So I think cyberpunk made these days can have a different flavor, certainly. Like when it comes with the endorsement of a major corporation, and it comes with the sheen of that as well, it can lose something, but it doesn't inherently. Like The Matrix is got to be one of the best examples of the genre, certainly to my taste, and it was made with the full backing of Warner Brothers checkbook. So I don't know if it inherently has to undermine what cyberpunk seems to be about, but I think it does come down to the filmmaker's vision and whether it's coming from an authentic place, probably.
It's probably worth mentioning that, as a conceptually, movies are just very expensive to make. So someone somewhere with deep pockets has to back one in order for them to get made, generally speaking, especially when they're high concept genre. But I think the sort of the big irony about a lot of those films is the one of the major social components of cyberpunk is resistance to conformity. And The Matrix is a great example. You really, literally got to unplug from the flock. I think that's something that just can't be rationalized. You know, the filmmakers don't belong to the corporation that finances these things. They have a story they want to tell and they want to reach an audience.
I worked on The Matrix, and I remember Joel saying things like, you know, it is about control, and it is about, you know, with a sort of semi-almost lesbian relationship at the end of the series. There was like a discussion around that, and breaking all the stereotypes is essentially what they were looking at doing. Funnily enough, Joel Silver is one of the most controlling people in Hollywood. So if you ever have the displeasure, you know, I have said this publicly that if I was offered a role to work with him on, say, a cyberpunk film, I would absolutely turn him down because he's got the wrong attitude as far as I'm concerned. But then again, I could have the wrong attitude, you know, to the whole idea, because, you know, I am a cyberpunk essentially. So I want to say fuck you to the system inherently. But yeah, I mean, I think that's what they were trying to capture, definitely, as Ben was saying. So.
But famously on that film as well, the character of Switch was meant to be played by two actors, right?
Yeah.
Male in the real world and female in the virtual one. And that's another edge that was trimmed down, or, you know, like it was nerfed, shall we say. And, you know, I had a light involvement with those films as well, because I actually won the pitch to write the role-playing game based on it. And I worked on that for a few months. It never got published, and the reason is because they were extremely closed about the story that was being revealed, especially because at the time they were working on the sequels, which was closely tied in, if anyone remembers, to a video game.
Yeah.
That actually had extra scenes that they shot, you know, during production of the films to fold into the video game, so you could explore other aspects of the story. It's sort of just another little piece of irony, isn't it, that that you have to be so controlling about something that literally has punk in the name.
Yeah. Spot on.
One of the key anxieties about cyberpunk, as people have already said, is about the notion of technology outstripping humanity, getting outside of our control or beyond our comprehension. And one of the key elements of that is AI and the evolution of non-human constructed intelligence. Now, Grant and Ben Young, you've both made films dealing with that. Do you have any insights on why we react so strongly to these notions, and why they find their way into stories again and again?
Which notions are they, sorry, Trav?
Just anxiety about AI, robot life forms, artificial life, things like that.
Oh, well, I mean, I didn't write Extinction, but I think that one of the things that I noticed when I read the script is, you know, it's the notion of machine outsmarting human, and I think that more and more, particularly when I went to university, I didn't even have an email address or a mobile phone or anything like that, and so I have certainly noticed how much more reliant we as humans are becoming on technology, and so I think that there is that inherent fear that this will eventually, you know, I mean, it already defines us, but it'll eventually get to the point where it overtakes us, and it's a real thing. I mean, I think that all movies, most movies, they deal with fear, you know, and in one way or another, and I think that it's a very real fear that machines will end up dominating our lives. And so it's just tapping into a fear, you know, whatever the genre is. Like, you know, we're scared of monsters. And so that's why movies like, you know, the Nightmare on Elm Street series work. And technology is just another fear that we as humans inherently have. And so, yeah.
Okay, Grant, anything to add or elucidate on?
Yeah, I mean, I think everything Ben said is bang on the money. And I think that the broader science fiction genre is sort of like a playground for ideas as they might impact human existence. You know, like you get to project forward and go, oh, what might happen if, and how would we handle such sort of circumstances, you know? And I think that the reason, you know, because your question is like, why are we constantly fascinated with robots and artificial intelligence more specifically? I think the answer is because they're fucking fascinating, and because there are so many different ways they could impact our lives. Like, I think, you know, it's obviously an area that I spent a great deal of time thinking about, like how I Am Mother can exist within the landscape of films about artificial intelligence and hold its own and say something different to what's been said before. So I've spent a lot of time thinking about the way that each filmmaker or each film approaches artificial intelligence. And a lot of the time it's about, what if they became smarter than us, you know? And there's a little bit of that in I Am Mother, of course. And a lot of sci-fi films, robot films, are about what if they had real feelings, you know? Like, what's to say that the emotions, the dreams, the thoughts that an artificial system might have, like, would be any different from our own? Are they real? Are they valid? Are they valuable? With I Am Mother, we were interested in sort of reflecting that back at the humans, actually, and saying, how sure are you that your thoughts and feelings are real and your own versus being programmed by your parents? And that, I hope, is a slightly different statement to, you know, something that's in Terminator or in The Matrix, or, you know, and these are all films that are about the same fundamental concept, but it has like machines that are smarter than us, that wield power greater than our own. But there are so many different opportunities to tell different stories and explore the ramifications of that. So I think that that's why it's appealing to filmmakers, because it's fertile ground, basically.
Okay, good stuff. We've had a real resurgence in cyberpunk recently in the cinematic space. A lot of really great films, stuff like Ex Machina, I Am Mother, like your own body of work, guys. We're getting a Matrix sequel, which may or may not be shooting right now, depending on what the COVID situation is. I haven't kept a close eye on it. Why is cyberpunk, which, let's face it, in the 90s and even the 80s, had the occasional hit, but generally kind of burbled under the radar, why are we getting a big resurgence in its popularity now, particularly as our own world is getting more dystopian and cyberpunkish? And as evidence, I present the fact that we're doing this panel internationally on the internet.
If I can take that one, cyberpunk is very much a world of escapism, and it's something that we've sorely needed in this time. It's sort of like, I recall Lenny saying in Strange Days, you know, you can slip on the troads and not even tarnish your wedding ring. It's kind of like, it comes in waves, and there will always be an underground movement of cyberpunk and cyberculture. But with these waves, it tends to have a resurgence when it's profitable for the studios. At least that's how I see it. So yeah, but like there's also the melding of the new sort of retro wave thing happening now, and that you know, painfully is very accepted within the cyberpunk aesthetic, with all the cheesy 80s songs that sort of find its way into this nostalgic kind of idea of 80s cyberpunk. So there is a bit of a resurgence of the music influencing film at the moment. And I think I've seen a lot of independent films that have had retro wave music as part of their main theme songs or that sort of thing. And it's set in dystopian cyberpunk worlds. But I think, yeah, I don't know if you guys know any mainstream examples of that have come through recently. Unless, you know, you're thinking like Thor had like retro wave music in it, you know. So.
Oh yeah, they do a lot of that, especially the 80s. They did into a lot because there was so much good music. But for me, with what actually, I've just lost the question. What was the question? Oh, I know what it was. Yep. I think a lot of it's got to do with what we can actually do now as well, for the amount of money. Like when I actually started to try and get up films 30 years ago, I had an imagination that was huge, but the budgets were like little we couldn't do it, and we didn't have the special effects. And then we got the special effects, but they were really, really expensive. And I mean, they still are, but there's things you can do now for a lot less than what you used to be able to do. So I think people can really let their imagination just go for it. And having a look at what they've been doing with I know it's not a film, but The Mandalorian over there at Disney with their 360-degree studio is pretty exciting, I think, for filmmakers and where they're heading with that. So I think a lot of the resurgence is, well, if you're doing just a movie that's based in reality, it's kind of all that technology is a little bit wasted. It doesn't really do very much. But with films like we're talking about here, it does a lot, and it makes a lot of difference, and it can be really, really spectacular in the movie studio.
It's turned me into a spoiled brat. Like, when I think of the sheer volume of awesome, amazing stuff that is available right now, for something like Altered Carbon to exist, right, at such a scale and so beautifully rendered and so realized, and yet I watch it and I'm not that excited by it. I don't love it. It's sort of like one of those shows that I'll pick at and I'll appreciate it. But if I was to rewind in time and tell 12-year-old me what would be available to me to watch, I'd be like, that sounds like the best thing ever. Are you crazy? Whereas, you know, I think of that age and I would be literally waiting years for the next Terminator or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's like, you cracked the code for me there, Ben, because, I mean, as Travis was saying, I was like, I mean, there are certainly high profile and exciting cyberpunk offerings on the horizon, and a smattering of them in recent years. But my instinct is that it's not like there's an overwhelming number of these projects out there. I felt like, you know, the vast majority of what gets made isn't, you know, as audacious as the cyberpunk genre kind of requires. And it's probably a byproduct of the fact that there's just so much more stuff made now. So like, if the 1% of their year's output that are going to be cyberpunk or dystopian sci-fi sort of films has remained more or less the same, they're just making so much more stuff between, you know, the demand from streaming services, but also the ability for, and kind of to Traci's point, independent filmmakers to sort of take on this stuff a little bit too. You know, like I Am Mother was certainly more possible, you know, thanks to the year in which it was made, than it would have been if it was made 10 years prior. So I guess, that there's it doesn't feel to me like we're overwhelmed with great options in the marketplace when it comes to sci-fi generally, and so, you know, and cyberpunk being a subset of that, there's even less of it. But you know, but at the same time, Ben is right, you know, that it's inconceivable that something like Altered Carbon might have been made and then just dropped into the world without as much fanfare as it might have been if it was made in the 80s. You know?
The uptick of that, of course, is that it means you recognize quality. And it means that the pressure is it's not on the effects, it's not on the scale of the production, it's on the story. If the idea sticks, if the story is well told and the characters are interesting, that can exist at any scale.
Yeah, I mean, take Ghost in the Shell, for example, with a recent live action feature film. I mean, I'm a huge fan of the Gitzak 1 and 2, which is the series that came after the movies. And there was just absolutely no story in that film for me, and it was like Altered Carbon as well. When I first looked at it, it was kind of like, I'm not invested in this at all, even though I know the characters like the back of my hand. You know, I didn't see anything new or anything that really related to the original movies that connected with me like it did in the anime. So I think that's a very valid point. I think to be fair to Altered Carbon is it did get better in the second season, and it did have a lot of that nostalgic references to the 80s kind of cyberpunk worlds and ideas, and even actors who appeared in several cyberpunk films of the 80s and 90s.
And I think another example, I mean, one of my favorite TV shows that I would consider cyberpunk is Utopia. And because the American remake so widely missed the mark, I was forced to go back and watch the original UK version, and just to see the night and day between how they were executed and also just their grasp of the message and what they were trying to say. It's you know, the story has to be told well, not just at a certain scale. So if anyone hasn't done it for a while, I definitely recommend going back and rewatching Utopia. You'll be rewarded.
That's on Amazon Prime if anyone wants to check that out. Like both the new American version and the original British version are available there. But I want to go back to something that...
If I could just drop a little warning, and they're very disappointed to find out that they've censored it a little bit. They've actually cut a few moments out, mostly surrounding things like child murder. So I understand why they would, but it's still disappointing that that a show would get cut like that.
Yeah. I want to go back to something which people have touched on a little bit in various sort of answers and comments. The subject of nostalgia keeps coming up. Now, because our own world has sort of outstripped and forked off from the predictions of like the literary roots of cyberpunk and even the filmic sort of examples of the 80s and 90s, is cyberpunk now a nostalgic genre? Is it a retro genre, or is it still vital and looking forward?
That's deep, man. I think that's it really depends on the motivation and who's doing it. Like, I think probably largely you are right. It was interesting, the references to Ghost in the Shell, the movie versus the anime and the series, and one of the things that really hobbled the live action feature adaptation of that was the fact that we were so familiar with the concepts and the imagery and that sort of stuff in that movie, because the original source material had been borrowed so many times over, right? Like The Matrix borrows heavily from Ghost in the Shell, and felt so exciting and fresh because Ghost in the Shell at the time wasn't as widely seen as obviously The Matrix was. And so at a certain point, the ideas and the images start to cannibalize themselves. And the genre sort of starts to lose its excitement until it's reinvented, or until it's referencing it. There's been enough time that the self-references become about playing into the nostalgia. So yeah, you might well be right with certain exceptions.
And it's generational to the point that you have to wait for the kids who were inspired by and grew up with a certain thing to get old enough to start making their own versions of it. So there's going to be, that's, to the point made earlier about there being waves, I think that's a big part of it. All my influences are 80s and 70s and 90s, but I certainly wasn't making anything back then. I was a child. So fast forward onwards, and I think, filmmakers tend to hit their stride somewhere between 30 and 50. And so that's the window where maybe you get access to what you need to make stories of that kind.
That's one of the reasons I'm worried that if we ever do eventually get a film adaptation of Neuromancer, we'll have seen all the tropes repeated in other media so much that it'll look old and tired, and I'll be heartbroken. But speaking of Neuromancer, obviously Cyberpunk began as mainly a literary genre. Are there any books or comics or whatever that you would love to see adapted, or even adapt yourselves? Like, what do we need in the cinematic space that we can pull from the literary space in terms of cyberpunk cinema?
Well, I'm sorry.
Oh, and you can't say your own.
You go, Traci.
All right. Well, I'll just be quiet then.
Well, Machete Girl.
Because that's great. Well, I mean, I go everywhere. I go past, present, future, backwards, forwards, and sideways, inner space, outer space, everywhere. So there's elements of cyberpunk in there that I'd certainly like to see done. Like, I definitely like a lot of the VR stuff. And I know that you, Travis, you absolutely massacred Ready Player One.
Yeah, not a fan.
For example, as a film.
I
took my 14-year-old boy to see it. I know, I heard. And I mean, it wasn't my be-all, end-all either, but my 14-year-old boy, seriously, when we came home, a little while later, I kind of found him crying because he'd been so involved with it, like really. So I think, a lot of it is about how much joy it actually brings to people. And I think that he enjoyed it so much he wanted to be there. And for me, it was reminiscent of Star Wars, because that's how I was when I saw it when I was like 11 or whatever. And I saw it 10 times at the cinema. I just loved it. And then I don't know how many times after that. But that first series was amazing. And I think, what you invoke in people is really, really important, and it will never get old to have a retro song thrown in. I have a story in mind where we're going into the future and everybody's sort of it's utopia and nobody has to work, but nobody's creative either because they don't have to be. They don't have to do anything they're getting everything supplied. And so everything they like, all the rebels like the music from back here because it was really good when we were motivated and inspired to actually make art. So there's so many places you can still go with it, I think.
I think Neuromancer is still different enough. Oh, sorry. I think Neuromancer is still different enough that if it came out now, it would still be its own unique property. It's just, obviously, William has had a lot of trouble getting a finalized script over the last several decades to try and get it out there. And there's been backers who have pulled out over the years. And I don't know, it's sort of created its own mythos of its own, but definitely if it was made well, I would want to see it. And of course, Machete Girl, which comes out in January. So it's what you
Go,
said
Gil.
we couldn't say. Thank you.
Well,
Thank you. It's
I mean,
my first novel, so I'm going to pick your brain, definitely.
That's exactly right. You go for it.
I mean, if
Yeah.
nothing else, Ready Player One, as much as I didn't like it either, I mean, at least all it did was lean on nostalgia. And nostalgia, you know,
Exactly.
it's there's a light and dark to that. I object to it being the reason for a film. However, you know, when you talk about something like Neuromancer, it's the OG, right? So that film has a place if and when it ever gets made.
I mean, if they can do Dune again, surely we can get Neuromancer just once.
Well, let's get another Johnny Mnemonic while you're at it. I mean, so Hollywood tends to do these
yes.
remakes of classic cyberpunk films, with Total Recall coming out again. And I mean, one of the reasons I loved I Am Mother so much was that it was just a completely original story, and the way that it dealt with the dystopia outside. I probably shouldn't be giving anything away to anybody who hasn't seen it, but it was just so beautifully told, with the relationship between the computer AI and humans. So I thought that really stood out.
You can see my stupid grin. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, like, that's what we want. That is what we want in cinema in the future. Is we don't want these rehashes and remakes and nostalgic films. We want original ideas, and I'd like to see more cyberpunk coming from Arabic countries, and you know, using technology to mix in with the, you know, harsh conditions and that sort of thing, to see
Some Viking cyberpunks.
Viking. Well.
And I'll just say that at the Sydney
Vikings.
Science Fiction Film Festival today, we have a session of Middle Eastern science fiction cinema.
From
There
Iran,
you
right?
go.
Hey,
Yeah.
look at that.
Yeah.
Stuff is out there. And if you've never read it, George Alec Effinger's When Gravity Fails is like the high watermark for Middle Eastern cyberpunk, to my mind. That is a fantastic book. Write it down.
Yeah, well, I literally am. And I'm writing down Viking cyberpunk, and I'm also writing down, what was the other thing? Wind punk? I'm like, I don't know what that is.
Oh,
but I'm
good
looking
idea.
it up.
Don't write that one, Ben.
Yeah. Solar
Well, if you
punk
want
is
to see something that fits that kind of genre, have a look at what was that Studio Ghibli film from the 70s? Nausicaa and the Valley of the Wind. Yeah, I mean that's essentially a cyberpunk film itself, and you could classify that as wind punk, I suppose.
Eco-punk and solar punk are big sort of elements sort of coming into it, and sort of cross-pollinating with cyberpunk as a genre these days, with the current climate crisis, which we are enduring. How do you think this is going to affect the genre going forward? What elements do you think we're going to be able to pull out of current real-world events and projected futures, which are going to inform science fiction over the next few years?
One of the things that troubles me the most, I think, is, and I've thought about this a lot over the last couple of years, is that cyberpunk is no longer speculative. We're actually living in that dark future. And I'm an optimist. I think things are, you know, as far as technology and people's awareness go, we're actually probably in a pretty strong place, regardless of all the terrible things that are happening around us. Having said that, when I actually tunnel down and like analyze all the stuff I read when I was younger, corporations in control, the glut of media, humanity being surpassed by our technology and social media addiction, the internet, full stop. All those things came true. We're in the middle of it. So we're no longer projecting to the future. We're just kind of dealing with the reality. And I think the environment's a big part of it, especially when you look at the sort of more post-apocalyptic dystopian cyberpunk entries. I think perhaps the difference is, whereas, 30, 40 years ago, that was considered fanciful.
It's now current affairs.
Now it's current affairs. So now the fiction has to be about what's the outcome of that? What happens when we run out of water or oil or whatever other resource, or, what happens when, not if machines take over, but when? What will that look like? And in what shape will that take? And how will that affect our humanity? So I think that's the subtle shift in how the genre is handled now.
Yeah, I think when Gibson stopped writing science fiction and started just writing contemporary techno thrillers, that should have been a big red flag. Like, we should have started worrying.
Ben, you mentioned optimistic sci-fi, optimistic cyberpunk. So being an optimist. But yet, this is a question I've had often about, is there room for optimism in cyberpunk?
I think so, absolutely.
Think so?
I love the idea of us actually creating something fantastic, really fantastical. I like going to those kind of worlds too. I really, really love everything being gorgeous, as well as a really good story, of course. But, so many series and films now are just so stunning to look at, as well as like moving to actually watch the stories. OtherLife was fantastic. I like watching the ending of that was just beautiful, and it was very emotive. And that's what you can get out of our genre. You can go anywhere with it. You can throw all those genres in and mash them all up and have a fantastic piece of filmmaking when you come out the other end.
Now, before we go to questions, because we do have an audience and we're going to take some questions at the end of the panel. Hot hits from the genre, your personal favorites, any films which people should seek out that they may not be aware of. If you're going to recommend a couple of cyberpunk films to anyone to either get them in or expand their understanding of the genre, what would you hit them with?
There's a tricky question to answer these days, because, your instinct is like, oh, I've got to hit them with some obscure little known gems that I can broaden people's horizons by introducing them to. But having done Q&As on the back of I Am Mother and gone into film schools and talk to people, it's amazing how old I am now. Because I can talk to teenagers and be like, oh, in the Matrix where this happens, they're like, what's the Matrix? I'm like, yeah, what's the Matrix? That was the whole marketing tagline. It's like, no, literally, what is the Matrix? I've never seen it. I don't know what you're talking about. So I'll take the easy question and the easy titles and jump in first and say, certainly if you haven't seen The Matrix, you should see that. And Blade Runner I mentioned earlier. I don't know if RoboCop technically fits the bill.
Oh, no, it counts.
I loved RoboCop growing up. You felt very you were looking into a world that you weren't supposed to be looking into, potentially quite literally. Like, if I was watching that, my dad was all right with it, but my mom most definitely was not, which is when you're watching a great movie. You found the sweet spot. So, those are sort of the primary colors of my cyberpunk world.
Okay, Grant's taken the low-hanging cyber fruit. Who else has got something?
I feel compelled to do the same. I feel like Strange Days, easily top 10. RoboCop is actually the metric by which I measure other films. I'll say it's 7 or 6.5 RoboCops. Definitely get into that one. I'll keep thinking while other people talk. I'm sure there are more obscure.
Well,
sorry, you go first.
I mean, Metropolis, right? That's probably a movie that not a lot of people have seen, but I remember seeing that at film school, and that certainly blew my mind. And maybe it's not cyberpunk because it's not really science fiction, but I think Hackers had a lot of cyberpunk elements, and
big time.
I really liked that because it was grounded very much in reality, and so that was a good one for me.
Tacos was great because it had that club scene in New York where all the kids got together and talk about all of their different levels of knowledge of packing. It was a huge influence. Yeah.
Sara, Traci, you got anything for us?
Well, like I said, I like the sort of more obscure ones, like Cloud Atlas had elements of it, and a lot of people really didn't. They either love it or they hated it. I loved it because I could see all the karma and everything that they were trying to weave through that movie. It was just so ambitious and so beautifully done, especially the Korean part of it. I thought was fantastic, and again, love the Fifth Element. Star Wars, I was born on, raised on, just adore. Not every the first trilogy. Can we just there? And since then, I think I've only really liked The Mandalorian. I'm kind of liking that because I'm a Baby Yoda fan and I love Baby Yoda. But so like the Fifth Element, and I also like Valerian and the City of 1,000 Planets. Like, I suppose that's kind of cyberpunkish. There's certainly a lot of machine in there, and but it was kind of cheesy to the point of like you just going, oh, really? But it was so enjoyable at the same time. I love all the concepts in it and everything. So, yeah, that would be my picks, I think. And The Matrix, I love the way that they actually, when you came out of the cinema, you had that suspended belief where you actually didn't feel like you were in your reality anymore. And there's only, I think Avatar maybe did that as well, where you were coming out, and Fern Gully, strangely enough, God knows why, but same kind of feeling of not quite being in your body when you come out of the cinema, which I really liked.
Okay, Sara?
So I agree with Strange Days, directed by Catherine Bigelow, written by James Cameron. He uses a line in that movie when he wrote it saying 2,000 years of evolution, and that's the best you can come up with. He also used that in the Cyber 6 ripoff, which was Dark Angel. But it hasn't aged well, I don't feel. Wonderful Days, which is a Korean anime, which is fantastic. Alita and Armitage 3 were just really, really great animes. Electric Dragon 80,000, which was just a fantastic black and white, esoterical kind of experience into the mind of somebody who has 80,000 volts running through his body. And Metropolis, the Japanese anime version, which was a really, really interesting adaptation of the original film. Ghost in the Shell, obviously, I mentioned before, Gitsack 1 and 2, I'm a big fan of, which is small series, but the new one, 2045, I find it unwatchable. Jinro, which was made into a live action film called Inrang the Wolf Brigade. So it was a Japanese anime which became a Korean film, at least I think so, from memory. But it was, just a fantastic story about Little Red Riding Hood set in a cyberpunk world. Probably one of the best, actually, in terms of cyberpunk. Oblivion for the more kind of, fantastic sets and futuristic ideology and cloning and robots and, pew pew, because I need my pew pew. Battle Royale 2, I'm a huge fan of. I watched the first one, which was great and all in Japan, but Battle Royale 2 was, it was far more kind of dystopian, post-apocalyptic cyberpunk, where these bunch of rebel kids took out, downtown Tokyo, and they're living on an island. They're being attacked by a bunch of, game masters, if you like. So that's definitely worth watching. And I'll just throw in I Am Mother for good measure there.
Hey, look at that.
Yeah, we've barely touched on video games or anime or sort of things outside of.
Oh, not at all, yeah.
And there's heaps of stuff to mention there. Now, I sort of nervously mentioned Cyber City Oedo. I remember loving it. It's been 25 years since I've seen it, so I'm not sure how it's dated, but it's probably worth checking out for nostalgic value. And if you were to rewind 35 years, who can forget Cops, the Saturday morning cartoon? Oh,
Lord. Oh, that's a deep cut. For my part, I'm going to go for, because you guys have mentioned all the great stuff. Abel Ferrara did an adaptation of William Gibson's New Rose Hotel with Christopher Walken and Willem Dafoe. And
I love that film.
Yeah, and Asia Argento. Real low budget, real lo-fi, like they keep the science sort of backgrounded and it's all about the gritty, sort of grimy street tone. Hard to find, well worth it. Okay, we might open up to questions now. If anyone...
Before we move on from that one.
Yep. Sorry?
Just on New Rose Hotel, was that influencing the what's it, the
$1 Million Hotel?
No, it was like the recent, the fairly recent, where you go into your dreams and then you go down the next level of dreams and rah, rah, rah.
Oh, Inception.
Inception. Do you feel like that was kind of like a influence on that? Because I always saw those two as related somehow, very similar.
Yeah, maybe a little bit. Anyway, we might open it up to questions. If anyone watching has a question for any or all of our panelists, just throw it into the chat and we will communicate that. I will turn to my guy in the chair and see if we've got any. At all.
Yep, what's some cyberpunk that's already become true?
What's some cyberpunk which has already become true? Well, the internet, right? The Matrix.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the funny thing is that like so often reality, is more benign but more bizarre than sci-fi is, right? Like nobody predicted the smartphone, in quite the way that we ended up having it. It's always like a walkie-talkie, or it's in your head. Like there's no in between. And of course, the reality is like the in between, but it has much larger and far-ranging societal impacts than anybody has really made a great movie about. Unless I'm missing it, somebody point me to the movie that's about kind of like smartphones that ruined the social order. But I'm sure somebody that's a better academic than I could point those things out. But we still are waiting for some of the most nightmarish sci-fi dystopias to come true. Thankfully, we're getting closer and closer by the year. But
and some of the best stuff too. Like we've got some of the hover skateboards, but they're not actually going down the street, and we haven't really got like the teleportation thing coming. And there's a whole argument that once you teleport, you're actually dead and you're just a clone after that, unless you go into a clone body. So there's kind of a lot of stuff that we haven't really got yet. I'm kind of a bit disappointed, actually.
That's
right. I think the big thing that's come true is, so much of the kind of ground zero cyberpunk stuff would often deal with the kind of corporate takeover of, or the monetization of society, and the idea that we'd return to a sort of more feudal or autocratic model where some big companies and private interests basically run the show, governments are dissolving, people are helpless as their rights are stripped away from them, by these economic forces. That's a big part of cyberpunk. And I don't know if that rings any bells, but that's definitely, or possibly the thing we didn't see coming is, in those old books, all the companies would be named something like Evil Corp. But now they're called things like Google. So we probably didn't see that coming.
I think that's
a really good point.
I have an unfair, I have a biased perspective, given the amount of time I've spent thinking about and researching robots. And it feels like robots now at this point in history, and I use robots loosely, I'm actually talking about artificial intelligence, but right now we are on the cusp of an artificial general intelligence. And that, I think, is the real, the shit from the sci-fi novels that we all grew up wondering about, worrying about, fantasizing about, like that genie's about to actually come out of the bottle, and I think that is actually going to really change a lot of things in a big way. I mean, the modern life we all live now is greatly underpinned by narrow super intelligence, like the way that we're talking to one another, and the way that our groceries make it to the supermarket, and the way that airline tickets are booked, like all of that stuff, the way the Wall Street works, a lot of it is really automated. But there's about to be a major shift where things that previously were considered not capable of being handled by machines are about to find their way into the hands of machines. And very quickly after that, everything, and more than everything that a human can do, will be able to be done by machines, basically. Yay! Let's hope they're nice. Let's hope they like it.
I don't think
Looked over
that's,
by machines of loving grace, I believe the phrase goes.
That's the one.
Which is a great
I don't
doco
think
available on
that's-
YouTube, folks.
There was
I don't think that self-checkouts were predicted either in shopping centers, but that is definitely a dark cyberpunk theme you could explore. Maybe the self-checkout comes alive and has a go at you for not paying the right amount of money, or not taking a certain coupon. That could happen.
chases you out of the store if you,
store.
put everything through as carrots.
We got another question, which is how does Asian cyberpunk differ from Western cyberpunk? Like, are there any?
It's far more fashionable and cool.
We lost you there. I missed it, but what was that?
Traci, can you
The
repeat?
question.
Your answer.
My answer was that it was far more fashionable and cool. Like, they always seem to be like, they just seem to really do that futuristic thing really well, I think.
I think
I'd say that's
Asian
fair
might be a
assessment.
little.
Such style.
I think Asian might be a little broad. Cyberpunk is often a response to a cultural mainstay, and like Japanese science fiction, for example, traditionally has been a response to the destruction at the end of World War II and the fallout of that. You look at stuff like Tetsuo Iron Man, where it's clearly about the degradation of the human body, that or Akira, of course, where Tokyo gets destroyed for the 50,000th time. You don't have to look too deep to see where those inspirations come from historically. And I don't know if you'd say the same for science fiction coming out of other parts of Asia.
Good point. And another point I need to make is that is our hour, folks. I hope everyone's had a real good time. I know I did. And I would like to extend my heartfelt thanks to my panelists, Ben Lucas, Ben Young, Traci Harding, Sara Joyce, and Grant Sputore. This has been awesome. I wish we could go for another hour, but we can't. And thank you to everyone who tuned in. Hopefully we'll get to do something just as fun next year at the 2nd Sydney Science Fiction Film Festival. So thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks, everyone.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you, everybody.
See you at the festival tonight.
Absolutely.